I have a rare condition called Auto-Brewery Syndrome, and basically what happens is my body begins to brew alcohol from eating food. Sometimes even extreme fasting can produce alcohol. When uncontrolled, my flares would sometimes go on for days and result in very high ethanol levels, and that can be dangerous to your health. And it requires specialized treatment, usually emergency medical care. This can include IV fluids, as well as special vitamins and minerals, and of course, constant medical supervision to monitor my condition. When my disease is uncontrolled, these flares can go on sometimes for days. And of course, a lot of people think that getting drunk without drinking sounds like an awful lot of fun, but I can tell you it is not fun. It is actually absolutely horrible, and it's a terrible condition for both myself and my family who has to suffer the consequences of that disease. And if you want more information on it, you can easily Google the disease, Auto-Brewery Syndrome. It is sometimes abbreviated ABS, and you can easily find articles on the web to read about it. Now, from the beginning of my illness, I received discrimination from medical professionals whenever I would go to hospitals. So I sought alternatives to going to hospitals and emergency departments, and those alternatives were home fluids with IVs, home nurses, home care, and unfortunately I was denied all of those alternative treatments, so I was forced, whenever I had a flare-up of my condition, to go to the local hospital. Now, where we lived, the local hospital was UPMC, that's University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, UPMC Horizon in Greenville, Pennsylvania. And I would just like to note that the first doctor who treated me there and subsequent doctors really throughout the system would speak horribly to me. They would accuse me of being an alcoholic, and this was all despite having two diagnoses from actual MDs. One was even a researching MD doctor from the University of California, San Diego. However, the doctors at the emergency departments in UPMC Horizon, they actually refused to acknowledge my diagnosis because my diagnosis did not come from a doctor within the UPMC system. Now, when I received treatment from the emergency departments, I was regularly verbally berated by doctors and even some nurses who threatened to kick me out of the hospital. They threatened to send me to jail and deny me care. One time during the night shift when I was there, they actually did remove me from the hospital. And this is really the beginning of some of the PTSD that came about in both my wife and myself surrounding doctors and medical facilities. I was harassed, I was screamed at, I was bullied by medical professionals, and they told me that I could never come back to the hospital. They told me that my condition was not a medical emergency, even though people have died from this condition. During this, I actually had a plan of care from a specialist who was treating me. He was a doctor, an MD, and he was a specialist who was treating my condition. He treats other ABS patients. And so we had a plan of care that he developed working with my PCP, and it was a signed plan of care. It was a treatment plan that we actually kept on file in the emergency department. However, the doctors of the emergency department refused to follow that treatment protocol. They also refused to consult with my PCP or my specialist who was treating my condition. Now, because of the nature of my illness and altered mood, hospital police were regularly present around me or in my room. And I would say this, generally they did what they had to do to ensure my own safety. But there were some there, and they are police officers. There were some officers there who clearly, I believe, resented me and my presence there. And one of them even physically threatened me with violence. And because of that, I actually filed a formal grievance against that officer, and the investigation was founded. And he received disciplinary retraining as a result of that grievance. Now, there was a particularly traumatic 3-day event where my attending physician actually threatened to press charges against me, even though I was in a medical crisis and not totally responsible for my actions. During that time, I was actually flaring very badly, and when I flared that badly, most of the time I actually would just sleep because my ethanol level was so high. However, my family was told that they couldn't come to see me in my room, and they actually documented in my chart that my family made me agitated, so they were kept from my presence. And that just was never the case. It was never true. They just didn't want them back in my room for some reason. Now, during that time, they also gave me a treatment that both I and my family had refused because we talked to my specialist about it, and he said, do not take that treatment. However, against my refusal, they forced that medication through my IV. And during that time, they actually requested a behavioral health specialist interview me, even though I wasn't stable enough medically for such an interview to take place, and if it did, it certainly wouldn't have much bearing on my situation. This was not routine. This was something that the ER doctors requested at that time. And the responses that the behavioral health specialist put into my chart were absolutely bizarre. They were incoherent. And my wife was also present during that interview, and she was taking notes of the interview. And when we read my chart, we both said, this isn't how it happened at all. So after he interviewed me, he actually pulled my wife aside. He pulled her out of the room, and then he interviewed her. And he documented that interview in my chart as well. And it needs to be said that he wrote down outright lies that weren't based in any form of reality. After the fact, we believe that this was going on to build a case that I was somehow mentally and socially unstable, and that I was a psychological and suicide risk. He also spoke to others at the hospital who were not part of my treatment team, and he asked them for information about me, and he recorded statements from them, including their personal opinions on whether or not I actually had ABS. Now, not only was this a violation of my privacy, I believe that this was also an ethics violation. And it should be noted that during this time, even though I was still flaring badly, the ER physician who was attending to me actually tried to make me eat a piece of chocolate cake because she wanted to see if it would flare my condition worse. She didn't know anything about my disease, but she read online about a carbohydrate challenge that could cause a flare-up of Auto-Brewery Syndrome. However, since she didn't know how to administer the test properly, and because I had already discussed this with my specialist, I refused that chocolate cake because I didn't know what would happen. And my specialist told me, do not let an ER doctor administrate a carbohydrate challenge because they cannot do it in the proper manner to receive an appropriate test result. So after this horrible 3-day incident, that's actually when we decided to reach out to patient relations to file a formal grievance against the hospital for my case. And I have to say that the patient advocate treated me very kindly and seemed supportive of my case, walking me through all the paperwork and the interview process. And honestly, I felt very good about this, and I had some hope that there would be a positive outcome to this whole process. And I know that ABS patients can be very frustrating to deal with for medical professionals, since most of them really don't have any experience with this disease, and especially treating this disease, and dealing with the illness as a whole. However, all I wanted was to be treated with dignity and basic humanity and receive the medically necessary care that I felt everyone deserves. I also formally requested that my behavioral health record be changed or at least amended to state that both myself and my family who was interviewed disagreed with the contents of that report. And so at the time, things were going along pretty well with the patient relations department, and we actually thought that there could be this type of change taking place in my case. However, when I received the resolution letter to my case, I was shocked to read that not only did they not find any fault with their medical team, and that they wouldn't actually amend my chart even to make a note that I disagreed with what was in it, but they also placed all the blame on me for refusing the carbohydrate challenge in the emergency department. And they also stated that I refused alcohol in the emergency department. And alcohol was never even offered to me in the emergency department, because that's something that emergency departments don't even do, give patients alcohol. My entire family and I felt so hurt and traumatized by this and really broken by it that we decided to contact the state attorney general's office to file a complaint. And they did their own investigation. That investigation resulted in the director of the hospital writing a letter that UPMC staff shouldn't treat patients that way. And then the attorney general just handed all of the investigation over to UPMC to deal with internally. Obviously, nothing was done by UPMC to correct themselves. They also threatened to sue both me and my wife because of supposedly defaming posts that we had put onto social media. And the reality is this, that never happened. Nothing that we placed anywhere publicly could possibly result in any type of a lawsuit. We believe that that was just more bullying and intimidation from UPMC to try to get us to shut up. During this entire ordeal, we experienced what at the time we believed was a positive, but sadly turned out to just be more salt in the wound. A UPMC chaplain came to my room and prayed, honestly, a beautiful prayer over me. He also worked with me, and he helped me to get in touch with patient relations, and he actually was an advocate for me. Now, I didn't know this man, and I had no contact with him outside of this particular situation, but I remembered him, and I remembered his participation in my case. Fast forward to today, several years after these incidents took place. Not only have my family and I tried to emotionally move on from these horrible events, but we actually physically moved from the area. We totally moved away. And I would say that that distance helped to begin to heal some of the hurt that we had experienced, but that was never resolved or even acknowledged by UPMC. However, those wounds and that trauma have actually been reopened, as that very same chaplain who prayed over me has regularly come onto my social media accounts to harass me. Now, these harassments over the past year or so have basically been more or less political differences. However, they have been accusatory and condescending, and basically he has demeaned me and basically called me an ill-informed idiot. Initially, I responded to his criticisms and critiques, but whenever I would respond, all that I got in return was more snarky sarcasm and personal attacks against my intelligence. So, after a while, I just stopped responding, and yet still he commented. Finally, I responded to him again because of something that he said that I thought was worthy of my personal response, and he chose that time to bring up my medical condition and question my diagnosis publicly on a public post in a public forum. And it wasn't enough for him just to be skeptical of my condition and my diagnosis, but he was downright defamatory towards me, referencing me as the town drunk. That's a personal attack on my character based on my medical condition. And I just honestly couldn't believe that someone who had been so close to my medical case would discuss such matters outside of a hospital setting, and honestly so many years after the event had even taken place. And this is not just a professional mistake. I believe that this is an ethical violation, not just of an employee of a hospital, but of a Christian minister. I currently have an open complaint with the UPMC Ethics and Compliance Department dealing with this very issue. However, I believe that this man is just one more instance of a pattern of behavior by UPMC and its employees. A pattern of misconduct, disrespect, and abuse. Just to let you know how traumatizing this illness can be, the patient advocate in our ABS support group, she wrote a statement out just chronicling how she cared for her husband who had ABS. And she states how horrible it was to care for him when he couldn't feed himself or take in fluids for himself. She had to spoon feed him. There are horrible, horrible side effects to this condition, including uncontrollable vomiting. And she talks about how she had to clean him and clean their house and their sheets multiple times per day. She talks about the incapacitation, the aspirations from vomiting, the stays in ICU where his life critically hung in the balance. And the list goes on and on of all of these horrible, horrible side effects to this condition. And I think it really needs to be said that if ABS sufferers had cancer, they would actually be surrounded by support and people would rally behind them. But because our illness paints us as the town drunk, we really receive nothing but stigma because of our illness, even from the medical community. Not only that, the health of our family members suffers. My wife's health has suffered because of the extreme stress and PTSD from this condition. You know, while I was extremely sick and flaring all the time, basically my wife lost her husband and my sons lost their father. Right now, my illness is currently under control. And so we have been attempting to, pick up the pieces and put together all of our brokenness and try to heal and move on. But now, with everything that has resurfaced, my question is, after everything that my family and I have gone through, how depraved does a system or a person have to be to continue the cycle of abuse?